Final Fantasy XVI has burst onto the PlayStation 5, proving to be a worthy addition to the decade-spanning series. And of course, you can check out our full review on the Push Square channel. But today, I want to discuss the big question. Is this the perfect Final Fantasy for newcomers to the series? Hello everyone, this is Aaron from Push Square, and I am the said newcomer in this scenario. Final Fantasy XVI is my first experience with the franchise, and after around 20 hours, I am loving it. So, to break down what exactly Square Enix has got right with this entry, I've got a very special guest. So, some long-time subscribers will be glad to hear that Aaron Potter has joined us today. Hello Aaron, how are you doing?
Hello Aaron, it's good to be back, and it's nice to speak with you as well about Final Fantasy XVI, one of the big PlayStation 5 exclusives of the year. I'm excited to get into it.
Yeah, I feel like it's a kind of sneaky PlayStation exclusive almost. I feel like it didn't... To me, anyway, I feel like it didn't quite have the same, level. And then it was only as the weeks came up to it, I was like, oh, this is actually like a pretty big PlayStation exclusive. I don't know if you had the same perspective on that.
Well, obviously, Final Fantasy's origins, I guess, begin with Nintendo. But following that, with the 3D period, 7 onwards, it was really intertwined with PlayStation. And I feel like because... Since a few weeks ago, when we had that PlayStation showcase, Marvel's Spider-Man 2 is kind of the only big first-party, single-player, third-person exclusive this year. Last year we had God of War and Horizon. I feel like PlayStation are wise to kind of be like, hey, Square Enix, you're basically a first-party game for the middle of this year. Let's amp up the marketing. Let's really get people excited. And I think it's worked for the most part.
What is your experience with the series? Because as I've said, I this is the first time I've ever played a Final Fantasy. What about yourself?
Yeah, so I'd say I'm it's funny you should say newcomer, because I very much feel a bit like a newcomer as well. I've dabbled with Final Fantasy games in the past. Obviously, I brought up Final Fantasy VII earlier. I played the original version of that back on my PlayStation Vita through PS1 emulation. The viewers will be pleased to know. And but I never completed it. Always admired it from afar, because obviously I was largely from the generation after. I was a bit young when it originally came out. And then pretty much from then, I've kind of bounced around the games since the HD era. So played a little bit of Final Fantasy XIII, not a very good game. It won't surprise many people to hear. And then Final Fantasy XV, I got quite a ways into, but didn't really feel the need to complete. I had some major issues with how Square Enix sort of tried making that transition to open world. So really, it's kind of been a haphazard approach for me in terms of Final Fantasy, specifically when it comes to the turn-based roots of the series. But yeah, always admired it from afar, dabbled here and there. But Final Fantasy XVI, similar to you, is kind of the first one that's really sort of grabbed me by the shoulders and said, hey, pay attention, because I'm actually a really good game.
Yeah, well, for me, watching these games from afar, it always just didn't. It never seemed like the kind of game or series that I would be into. Looking at, I remember seeing some demo stuff for 15, and then obviously 7 remake, and then they had the Intergrade remaster,
for PS5.
Yeah, but that's me showing how little I know about the franchise, but. For me, it almost I'm not a huge fan of kind of anime JRPG stuff, and that to me always seemed too much of that. And obviously, I think one of the big things that we'll probably get into, as far as I'm hearing with this one, is that the sort of English localization of this one has made it a lot more natural sounding for English speakers, because before it's obviously been translated from Japanese, so it almost never. It never seemed to quite hit the level for me of quality, I would say. I know obviously this is me saying it for someone that hasn't played them, but to me it didn't quite hit that mark for me of what I look for in a game. That was the thing with this one, because as well, to say turn-based combat, I know some of them haven't had it, I just do not like it.
Right.
I cannot get behind turn-based combat at all. Looking at this one, I think because obviously I was editing together the previews, and it was the first time where I went, oh, this actually looks kind of cool.
Yeah.
So what do you think stands out to you for this new game that is different from the previous ones, that's kind of making it seem like it will be a bigger, more mainstream hit for the series?
Yeah, I agree with you. I feel like there's a bit more of a concerted attempt with Final Fantasy XVI to sort of almost cater towards Western audiences, whereas historically that's not always been the case. And it's a weird position to be in from Square Enix's point of view, because every Final Fantasy up until now, I'd say, has been unabashedly anime and sort of like its own thing. Whereas, whether it be, the sort of like dialects that are in the game, the sort of regional accents that are in Final Fantasy 16, and obviously they've done a lot more of an attempt to make the localization work a lot more with 16. Because as someone like from the outside, similar to you, that has always been like it's not, I wouldn't say it's put me off, but it's always been a bit of a factor. However, I will say like I unabashedly love turn-based games. Like I feel like there's place in the world or in the industry rather for them both to coexist. But the problem that sort of Final Fantasy XIII really did it for Square Enix in terms of ruining things, because it was so turn-based, but then at the same time you had this AAA production quality where it didn't quite make sense that the sort of way battles played out, they didn't feel as cinematic or as engaging as they probably should be, given the impressive nature of the visuals. And I feel like that sort of carried on over with Final Fantasy 15, which, because obviously 14 was the MMORPG, was available on PlayStation, but very much its own thing. Like 15 just kind of didn't really know what it wanted to be. It was kind of like, we're an open world game but with real-time combat, but at the same time it's sort of, we're only going to let you interact with the open world to such an extent, and you're still going to have these stilted cutscenes, characters that like maybe talk to each other a little bit awkwardly. And then I'm someone that didn't really get on board with the Final Fantasy VII remake hype, specifically because it was a gorgeous looking game, but the materia system, like, we're going to call it, limit breaks, but it's not an active time battle. But even though it's called these things, they're going to operate very differently. And I feel like they were trying to, Final Fantasy VII was caught between both worlds, whereas I feel like Final Fantasy XVI, by maybe leaving a bit more of the RPG-ness of it all into the background and kind of swerving more along the lines of a proper character action game, it's Square Enix saying like, look, we've tried to make it work in the past in terms of paying tribute to Final Fantasy's roots, and Final Fantasy XVI is they've been actively inspired by a more Western style approach, which is an interesting thing to say, because how this game handles combat is very much inspired by Devil May Cry, which is, a very Japanese game in and of itself. But at the same time, I would argue that Devil May Cry 5, which is the most recent Devil May Cry, it kind of gears towards, a more Western style itself. So by indirectly being inspired by Devil May Cry 5, Final Fantasy 16 has ended up, being more westernized in style. And you can see that with the sort of medieval focus that Final Fantasy has always had, oddly, but it's always been through that Japanese filter. Whereas I think here it's kind of like the best of both worlds, or a perfect balance for both worlds. But I can understand if you're a long-time Final Fantasy fan, wanting Final Fantasy to be a certain thing. Like, I reviewed it for Mirror Gaming, which is where I am now, and I start off the review by saying your enjoyment of Final Fantasy 16 will be very much dependent on what Final Fantasy means to you. If it's turn-based battles, if it's managing a party, if it's waiting for meters to fill, you're probably going to be disappointed. But if Final Fantasy means, an engrossing story, intriguing characters, and engaging combat, Final Fantasy 16 has that in spades. And I feel like specifically from a newcomer's perspective, you couldn't ask for more from Final Fantasy 16.
And as far as I understand it, the series has always been somewhat like, it likes to evolve and change. So it's like no two Final Fantasy games are really the exact same. Whether that be like, the story and kind of world aspects of it, the combat aspects of it, the general structure. I know a lot of people were complaining about the lack of RPG-ness in this one, but I found it refreshing in a way to have a game that likes to kind of ebb and flow in terms of being completely linear, a little bit more open, fully explorable areas, but not really asking you to go, quite often with these games. And I'm assuming a lot of the subscribers as well will know that, like, when you get a little bit older, these big RPG games become harder and harder to play. When it go, I love, for example, on Xbox Starfield, I love the sound of that game. It sounds almost like my dream game, but I know I'll never be able to play it to the extent they want me to. I just don't have the time or the attention span for something like that. With the nature of us in our industry, we're always kind of moving on from one thing to the next thing to the next thing. So like, playing something like that for hundreds of hours just isn't quite as feasible as it used to be when we were younger. And I like that about this game, where it feels like a really big and expansive game, but doesn't really like rip it with these overly dense systems. I like that there was leveling, but I'm not actually having really to think too much or invest in it. It's just kind of naturally happening with the game. And I liked that balance I found with this one. What do you think the perspective would be then for long-time fans? Do you think this is something that seems like it could be like disappointing to see it move away?
I think it is going to be disappointing for long-time fans to see the RPG-ness sort of, which is a term that I keep wanting to use for some reason, the RPG elements to sort of fade away, because as you say, like, they're there, but if you don't want to focus on them, you don't really have to. It's kind of a case of keep playing the game, level up, numbers go up. And then there's 3 gear slots that you can choose to upgrade. And literally, as I was playing through the game, the only thing that mattered to me was, does number go up? If number doesn't go up, then I don't want to have to worry about it. So they kind of have sanded down the rough edges of it all in terms of like the Final Fantasy RPG roots, which I agree is a shame. But other than Pokemon, it's kind of the state of the industry that we're in, where turn-based games kind of have a limited appeal now, especially kind of when like the AAA skin is kind of like retrofitted onto the top of it. It kind of like doesn't add up, and I feel bad saying that, because that's not to say that like turn-based games can't look beautiful, because they absolutely can, but they just don't have a tendency to look like this. And when a game looks as good as Final Fantasy XVI and as polished and as confident as it is, I feel like, you know, entering a battle where you're literally seeing 3 members of a party stand still while you click through menus, it just isn't as engrossing or as engaging as even the developers probably want it to be honest. Like, they just want you to be in the shoes of Clive Rosfield, in the heat of the action. But that's not to say there isn't a great deal of strategy and tactics that come in the combat, because through the icon abilities, the icon switching, and like obviously you're having to wait for these skills to recharge, there is a degree of strategy that is into the combat, which I would argue the problem is that RPG has become such a ubiquitous term. Like, most AAA games are RPGs now anyway. Like, RPG doesn't mean one thing anymore. God of War has become an RPG. Horizon is very much an open world RPG. So I don't think it's wrong that just as those games were inspired by the JRPGs of old, now you find that Final Fantasy XVI has been influenced by the games that were influenced by the original versions of Final Fantasy. It's kind of like cyclical in that way. But having said that, like, if you are in the market for a turn-based modern Final Fantasy game, I can see why you'd be disappointed, but it's just not the world that we live in anymore. Square Enix needs this game to sell, and in order for it to sell, they need to appeal to like the most mainstream audience possible, unfortunately, especially when you're an exclusive on a console like PS5.
And that is kind of what has done it for me, because the combat in this is so fun, it's so flashy in a way, to the point that even the QTEs are great. It's probably the best version of a QTE.
I like how they don't call them QTEs
like,
as well. It's like cinematic attack, cinematic evasion. Like, it's a QTE.
Yeah. I like though how it blends those elements, and it's always all about being like super hyperactive and epic at all the same time. You know, those are the things that like 2 players like me are bringing me to a game like this, where I've sank as much time as I have into it. If they hadn't really convinced me with the combat stuff, I probably just wouldn't have touched this game, just purely from the fact of like, I know I'm not really into Final Fantasy. This game, you know, kind of turned the tide, and I feel like in a way I'm exactly the kind of person that they're trying to convince to buy this game. You know, those that haven't really touched it before, but they're aware of it, and they go, oh, here's Final Fantasy, but you know, this is flashier, it's more accessible in a way, and it's far more polished, because genuinely the story and the cutscenes and the way that it kind of moves from one to the other is just, it's really been bringing me into it. And I think it always has the right level, like I was saying, of going between more expansive and more linear, because I kind of hate it sometimes in a game where it'll go like, oh, you have this whole section, and then it'll go, right, okay, go do what you want for 10 hours. And you're like, right, okay, I'll need to build up before the next good bit. But I feel like the pacing is really there as well.
And to be honest, I mentioned earlier about like the awkwardness that Final Fantasy would tend to have, and I still feel like like if that is a hallmark of Final Fantasy to you, there's plenty of awkwardness in Final Fantasy 16 as well, in the terms of like, you'd be back at the hideaway, and it'd be like, talk to this person, walk 2 feet, press X, dialogue. Okay, now walk 5 feet, X, dialogue. Like things like that. Like, it's very, it hasn't lost that jank that I feel like certain people tend to equate with Final Fantasy games for wrong or right reasons. And I just want to say, like, if you are looking for the turn-based AAA-esque experience, Square Enix still has you covered by way of the Dragon Quest series, and I feel like that's sort of like how they're looking at it now. It's like Final Fantasy is the prestige product, and then for people that still want a very much like a classic style JRPG, Dragon Quest is there. But you can see that even Dragon Quest is adapting in terms of like, it's a third person game that is now open world-esque, as opposed to just, you move from one location to the next without returning.
I think they've managed it really well. I'm quite excited. Obviously, neither of us have completed it at this point. It's a pretty big game, but I'm usually, if it was a game like this and I was having to play it for work, it would be the kind of thing where I play it to a point and then just go, right, well, I don't need to anymore. But this, I feel like, I'm cutting out time for this weekend to play this game because I still want to play it. It kind of, even from the demo, as a lot of people have seen with that, it's a good game.
It's a good game.
It's a good game,
and I feel like trying to like boil down to like, oh, what genre is it? What does Final Fantasy mean? And like, I feel like it, like, why are we having that discussion as opposed to, look, this is the game that it is, and let's enjoy it for the game that it is.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I understand that there's a big 16 at the end of the title, but as you alluded to earlier, Aaron, every Final Fantasy game is different. And just because Final Fantasy XVI plays like this doesn't mean that Final Fantasy XVII will. In fact, I don't think it will. I hope there are elements that it carries forward, like the cinematic linearity of it, which I come to appreciate, because not every game needs to be open world. But I expect Final Fantasy XVII to have a vastly different combat system. Like, you're not going to be switching between icons. And if they do want to keep with this, what they've historically done is Final Fantasy X-2, Final Fantasy XIII-2. I'd like to think that because these characters are so engaging and so well-rounded and the combat is being so well received, that we will probably get a Final Fantasy XVI-2 in some form. Where this sort of continuity will live on whilst another team makes Final Fantasy XVII. But I think it's very interesting, and this is perhaps a separate conversation, that the team that made Final Fantasy XV then went on to make a little game called Forspoken, and look how that game turned out to be. Like, thank God that Forspoken didn't end up being called Final Fantasy XVI, because I'd much rather have this than that. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think we can wrap it up there, but I have been thoroughly impressed, and it has me even kind of retroactively thinking like maybe I should consider checking out 7 Remake or 15, and I still don't really think that I could delve into the older ones that are going more into this turn-based, but it does have me kind of reflecting on the ones that I just completely shoved off before because it was Final Fantasy. It has me reconsidering that, and I think that's exactly what the aim was with this game, to make people that never thought about Final Fantasy kind of have that little point in their brain where they're like, this might actually be a series worth diving into. But I want to start out by thanking you, Aidan. Sorry, I called you Aidan.
Whoa, not this again.
I know. I want to start out by thanking Aaron for dropping by. You're welcome here anytime, of course.
Thank you for having me.
And as for you lot out there, thank you for checking out the video. Let me know your thoughts on Final Fantasy XVI. Is it the perfect entry point for new fans? Does it maintain that special Final Fantasy sauce for you? You can let me know down in the comments. And while you're down there, why not leave a like, and even better, subscribe to the channel for more PlayStation video content. Anyway, folks, I've been Aaron. This has been Push Square, and I'll see you in the next one.